They said the marble was flawless, cold, white, and perfect. But in the spring of 1972, a single tear slipped from its carved cheek. Doctors tested it. Priests prayed over it. And yet, the tears never stopped. The Vatican ordered silence. And within months, the statue was gone. The camera drifts slowly, across stone, across arches that seemed too tall for the human eye. And then it stops on her, the Virgin in white marble. The first time the doors opened, light from the stained glass caught her face. The parishioners said it looked alive. Too alive. Her gaze was not the frozen stare of a statue. It lingered. It followed. And though her lips were carved shut, they seemed parted, almost moving, as if whispering, prayers no one could hear. The unveiling of the White Madonna was meant to be a triumph for Cathedral. The bishop called it a miracle of craftsmanship. The papers wrote about the anonymous donor who paid for it, though no one knew who he was. Some claimed it had been carved in secret, by hands that did not sign their name. On the morning of the unveiling, hundreds gathered. The church bells rang. Children clutched their mothers' sleeves. Old men straightened their coats and shuffled into the nave. And when the curtain fell, when the marble shone in the morning light, an audible hush fell over the congregation. Even the babies stopped crying. No one breathed. For a long moment, the cathedral was silent. And then came the applause. They said it was beauty itself. The folds of her robe so intricate, they seemed to ripple when the sun shifted. Her hair fell in delicate strands, as if wind had once passed through it. Her skin, polished marble, appeared soft, translucent, human. Too human, one parishioner later wrote in her diary. It was not like looking at stone. It was like looking at a woman who had been captured in stillness. She was alive, but she was not allowed to move. The bishop dismissed those words as poetic exaggeration, but others thought the same. Her gaze unsettled them. It was not pointed toward heaven, as so many statues of Mary are. It was not bowed in humility. Instead, she looked outward, straight, level, toward those who gathered at her feet. A sculptor in attendance was overheard whispering, "Eyes don't belong in stone like that." Another man claimed he felt heat radiating from her skin, like warmth rising from a living body. But such claims were quickly silenced, because the White Madonna was a miracle. That was the only acceptable truth. In the days after, the faithful came in greater numbers than ever before. They pressed their hands against her robe, left flowers at her feet, whispered prayers into the quiet curve of her lips. Some swore that when they prayed, they heard words return, not in sound, but in thought. The bishop smiled. The donations rose, and the cathedral declared itself blessed. But something wasn't right. There were whispers among the parishioners that at night, the sacristan would cover the statue in cloth, as was tradition. Yet sometimes, when he returned in the morning, the cloth was disturbed, shifted, fallen. He swore he tied it tightly. And once, he swore he found it folded neatly on the floor, as if someone had removed it and placed it there. The cathedral staff laughed at him, called him tired, called him old, but he did not laugh. He said the cloth was warm when he picked it up. The rumor spread in silence. Families leaving Mass spoke of unease, of how their children stared too long at the statue, how their infants would begin crying when carried near her. One woman confessed that she no longer brought her baby to the cathedral at all. The gaze, she said, was unbearable. It was not maternal. It was watchful, and the longer one stood before her, the more one felt weighed, judged. The bishop dismissed it all. A miracle always drew doubt, he said. A marvel always stirred suspicion. But he too began to avoid her gaze. And yet, he could not explain why. One evening, after Vespers, the last of the faithful had gone. The cathedral grew quiet. Candles flickered. And Father Moretti, an assistant to the bishop, lingered near the statue. He had been instructed to guard it, to ensure no one approached it in the night. But as the silence grew, he began to hear something. Not sound, not words, but something. A movement, faint, almost inaudible, like the shifting of lips, like a whisper escaping stone. He turned, looked around. The pews were empty. the shadows motionless. Yet when his eyes returned to her face, he swore her mouth had changed. Not opened, not closed, just different. He left the cathedral in haste and told no one. The weeks passed. The White Madonna became a point of pilgrimage. Travelers came from villages, towns, even cities far away. They lined the steps, waiting hours for a glimpse, and each described the same thing. Her gaze, her lips, her unbearable stillness. One pilgrim said, "It is like standing before someone who wants to speak, but is forbidden. She is suffocating under silence." The church silenced that as well, but suspicion was rising. The marble was tested by experts. Artisans and historians came to study the work. They confirmed it was stone, pure, untouched, yet each one left quickly, declining to return, refusing to speak of what they felt while standing before her. Only one sculptor dared to write his impression. His note survives. It is the eyes. I do not know how the artist carved them. They are not stone. They are human, and I do not wish to see them again. The note was not published. It was tucked away in the diocesan archives, and the statue remained, but unease had taken root. Some parishioners avoided her altogether, choosing pews far from her gaze. Others left the cathedral entirely, whispering that the Madonna was not holy, but something else, something unspoken. One night, a woman named Clara was the last to leave. She paused before the statue, flowers in hand. She bent to place them at Mary's feet, and when she looked up, she froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She could not move. The lips, they were parted wider. She swore she saw them curve into the faintest smile. Clara dropped the flowers and fled. She never returned to the cathedral, and though she tried to dismiss it as fear, she later told her husband in a trembling voice, "It was not stone that smiled at me. It was a woman." He believed her, because weeks later he saw it too. The bishop never admitted what he saw, but those close to him claimed his sermons grew darker. He spoke less of mercy, more of judgment, less of heaven, more of silence. The parishioners said he seemed afraid, but he would not confess why. The statue remained, and those who dared stand before her longer than a moment began to notice something else. A feeling, not of peace, not of prayer, but of being studied. It was as if the Madonna was not receiving devotion, but learning from it, watching, weighing. One priest broke down after weeks of service. He left the cathedral at dawn, shaking, unable to explain. When pressed, he whispered only, "It watches. It never stops watching." And then he resigned. The church replaced him quickly, but the whispers remained. Children began refusing to walk past her. One boy screamed until his mother carried him out. Another insisted her eyes followed him all the way home. A teenage girl fainted during Mass, collapsing in the aisle. When she woke, she said only she was moving. The priest told her it was a dream, but others were not so sure. The donations began to slow. The pews, once overflowing, grew thinner. People came out of curiosity, but few returned a second time. The cathedral tried to suppress the stories, but unease has a way of spreading, and soon the town itself was whispering. The White Madonna was beautiful, yes, but not holy, not blessed, not safe. And though the church tried to hold the narrative, the truth was out. Something wasn't right, and the people knew it. By autumn, only the devout remained. They lit their candles, left their flowers, whispered their prayers. But even they admitted, her gaze weighed on them. One old woman confessed that she covered her mirror at home after visiting. She said the Madonna's eyes had followed her reflection. Another man admitted he could not sleep, that when he closed his eyes, he saw her lips moving, and though he tried to pray, he could not shake the feeling that the prayer was not his own, but hers. That was only the beginning, because the White Madonna had not yet revealed what she truly was, and the faithful had only just begun to listen. The camera drifts across the cathedral. The stained glass spills fractured colors over stone, reds and blues trembling against the marble floor. Candles hiss softly in their brass holders. The air carries a scent of incense, heavy, clinging sweet to the point of suffocation. It is Easter morning. The pews are full, families shoulder to shoulder, children tugging at their parents' coats. The choir's voices rise and fall, steady, controlled, trained to mass fatigue. And at the center, watching from her pedestal, stands a white Madonna. For weeks, she has been the object of devotion. For weeks, her gaze is unsettled and inspired. For weeks, her parted lips have drawn whispered prayers from those too afraid to speak them aloud. Now, with the cathedral overflowing, she looms larger than ever. All eyes are meant to be on the altar, on the bishop, on the golden chalice raised in trembling hands. But not every eye is obedient. A boy, 9 years old, sits in the fourth pew from the front, his father beside him, his mother gripping his shoulder to keep him still. The boy does not look at the chalice. He does not look at the bishop. He looks at her, and that's when he sees it. Something running down her cheek. A thin line, shimmering, alive in the colored light. At first he thinks it is a trick of the glass, the way sunlight bends through color, turning stone to skin. But when he squints, when he leans forward, the truth becomes clear. It is liquid. It is moving down her face. The boy tugs at his mother's sleeve, whispers, points. She swats his hand away, murmurs for him to be still, but he cannot look away. The white Madonna is weeping. When Mass ends, the boy insists again, his voice louder now, his words overheard. Parishioners gather, their gazes follow his finger, and then the silence spreads, because they see it too, a trail of moisture on marble, running from the corner of her eye, down the flawless cheek, stopping at the edge of her lip, a tear. The sacristan pushes through the crowd. His hands tremble as he reaches up with a cloth. He wipes the surface once, twice, steps back. The crowd waits. And then another tear forms, slow, heavy, sliding down in silence. The gas that moves through the nave is almost louder than the bells. The bishop intervenes quickly, his voice booming. He insists it must be condensation, moisture trapped in the cold marble, released under the heat of candles. Some nod, eager to believe, but others do not, because condensation does not fall in perfect streams. Condensation does not taste of salt. The boy's father steps forward, runs his finger across the wetness, presses it to his tongue before anyone can stop him. His face pales. "It's not water," he whispers, and the crowd surges with sound. Some shout miracle. Others whisper blasphemy. The bishop orders the statue sealed, a cloth draped over her. The doors of the cathedral locked for the day, but the damage is done. The story spreads through the town before evening. By nightfall, it has crossed villages, traveled roads, reached ears that had never before cared for cathedral. The white Madonna had cried, and people wanted to know why. The following week, the church permits an examination. Scientists, doctors, even skeptics. They arrive with vials, swabs, sterile cloth. Under careful eyes, the statue is uncovered, her gaze once again revealed, her lips parted in silence, and almost immediately, another tear falls. It is collected, preserved, tested. Days later, the results arrive. The substance is not condensation, not resin, not wax. It is human tears. The report shakes the congregation. Some take it as proof, a miracle, a blessing beyond comprehension. Others recoil, because what does it mean for stone to weep with the fluids of flesh? Where does it come from, and why? The church attempts to control the narrative. The bishop declares a sign, a gift from heaven to remind the faithful of suffering, of sacrifice. He speaks of Christ's agony, of Mary's sorrow. The tears, he says, are not to be feared. They are to be revered. But not everyone accepts this. The sacristan, who first wiped the statue clean, refuses to stand near her again. He tells his wife he feels unclean, as though touching that wetness had stained him. The boy's father begins to drink heavily. He cannot forget the taste on his tongue. Salty, warm, human. He tells a neighbor in hushed tones, it wasn't from her. It was from something inside her. Others whisper that the statue should be removed, that no stone should bleed the fluids of man. But the cathedral resists, because the pews are once again full. Pilgrims flood the nave, kneel before her pedestal, weep openly in her presence. Some bring jars, cloths, desperate to touch the tears for themselves. And when they are denied, some claim they hear her anyway, not with ears, but with thought, as if her parted lips were whispering from inside their own minds. The division grows sharper. Miracle, blasphemy, two words, tearing a congregation in half. One night, Father Moretti lingers again after Vespers. He stares at her covered form. He waits. He prays. And in the silence of the empty cathedral, he hears something. A sound, not liquid this time, but breath. He leans closer, his own chest tight, his own breath shallow, and he swears he hears it. A woman, weeping. He flees before the cloth is removed. He does not return the next morning. The bishop preaches harder, louder, his words more severe. His sermons no longer speak of grace, but of endurance, of trial, of judgment, because even he cannot deny the unease. Even he cannot stand before her without trembling, but still he tells his people, this is holy, and they believe, or they pretend to, but something wasn't right, because if these were tears of sorrow, why did they feel so heavy? Why did they taste of grief? And why, in the stillness of cathedral, did the faithful begin to wonder, was she crying for them, or because of them? The camera lingers in silence, across the cobblestones, across the cathedral doors where shadows pool. At night, the building does not sleep. Its windows glow faintly from candlelight left burning inside, and for those who dare to pass by after dark, the sight of the white Madonna, shrouded beneath her cloth, was enough to chill the blood, because they said the cloth moved, as though it rose and fell with breath. The rumors began quietly, a whisper between neighbors, a cautious word exchanged at market stalls. But within weeks, the entire town carried them. Some claimed the tears glowed at night, that when the candles guttered and the nave was empty, a faint shimmer bled from her eyes, as if the stone itself held light. Others said they heard her breathe, a sound low and steady, echoing between the pews, like the breath of someone sleeping. But something wasn't right, because those who claimed to hear it swore they weren't alone in the pews when it happened. They said the air shifted, that the silence of the cathedral thickened, and when they turned, the statue was no longer only stone. They stopped short of describing what they saw, but their voices shook, and their hands would not stop trembling. The bishop denounced the stories. He called them exaggerations. He said the faithful were allowing their imaginations to overtake their devotion. But even as he dismissed them, the pilgrims kept coming. Every morning, the cathedral steps filled with a line of strangers. They came barefoot. They came carrying rosaries, charms, heirlooms, folded photographs of their dead. They came to leave offerings, coins scattered at her feet, rings laid on the marble steps, handwritten prayers tucked into the cracks of the pedestal. And in the pews, the whispers spread. One woman claimed she asked the Madonna to heal her child, and that night, the child's fever broke. Another swore she prayed for her husband's return from war, and weeks later, a letter arrived. For every story of despair, another story of hope, and yet, the hope never felt clean. The prayers were whispered in trembling voices, the offerings placed with downcast eyes. The pilgrims never lingered. They gave, and then they fled, as if giving was safer than staying. The skeptics gathered as well, not to kneel, but to warn. They stood on the edges of the square, speaking to faithful as they lined up at dawn. They said it was deception, that human tears in stone were not a blessing, but a trick. They quoted scripture, cited false prophets, spoke of idols that ensnared the soul, and though some listened, most did not, because the statue's presence was stronger than words. One man confessed that he believed the skeptics, that he knew it could not be holy, and yet, when he stood before her, he dropped his coins anyway. I couldn't stop myself, he admitted. It was as if she was waiting, as if she was watching to see if I would give. He never returned, but his offering remained. Inside, the cathedral staff began to notice the atmosphere shifting. The pews no longer carried only prayer. They carried fear. Fear that the Madonna's gaze was not passive. Fear that her parted lips were not still. The whispers grew louder. Some swore they heard her voice, not in words, but in murmurs, a low, unending sound that seemed to bleed into the walls. Others claimed they heard their own names. One woman, kneeling with her rosary, collapsed when she swore she heard her husband's voice whisper from Madonna's lips, a husband who had been dead for 5 years. The bishop silenced her testimony. He ordered it stricken from record, but the damage was done, because the faithful kept coming. Every day the line grew longer. Pilgrims camped on the steps overnight, lighting candles in the square, sleeping on the cold stones. They wanted to be the first inside, the first to stand before her. The town changed. Shops opened earlier to sell bread to the waiting crowds. Vendors set up stalls with rosaries, crosses, printed pamphlets, prayers. The economy thrived, but beneath it all was a sound, the sound of whispering in the pews, always low, always untraceable, as though the Madonna herself was teaching them to pray. And then there was the boy, the same boy who first saw her tears. He returned one evening with his father, sat in the pew, stared at her face, and he began to smile. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, asked what was so funny. The boy's smile widened. "She's talking to me," he whispered. The father froze. "What is she saying?" The boy's voice was soft. "She's telling me what to do." And that's when the father pulled him away, dragged him from the pew, out the cathedral doors, into the street. He refused to step inside again. He told no one the rest of what his son said, but he left town within the week. The cathedral did not comment. The bishop did not speak of it, but those who were present swore they saw the boy's eyes before he left, wide, bright, unblinking, as though something was still speaking to him. The pilgrims kept coming. The skeptics kept warning. But in the pews, in the shadows, in the silence of cathedral, the whispers grew louder. And for those who dared to sit long enough to listen, they realized the whispers weren't many. They were one, a single voice, patient, watching, waiting. The camera drifts forward, through the open doors, into the nave where candlelight flickers against stone, where the scent of wax and incense bleeds into every surface, and where silence hangs heavier than prayer. The white Madonna waits, her gaze still level, her lips still parted, her tears by now part of the town story. And the line of pilgrims grows longer each day. They come carrying hope. They come carrying fear. But one morning, it is not an old man with shaking hands, not a grieving widow, not a desperate parent. It is a girl, 7 years old. She enters the cathedral holding her mother's hand. She does not fidget. She does not tug. She walks calmly, her eyes fixed straight ahead on the statue that towers above the altar. She does not kneel in the pews. She does not bow her head. She lets go of her mother's hand, and she walks forward alone. The crowd watches. Her footsteps echo against the marble. The air shifts, and then she reaches out. Her small hand brushes the white Madonna's cheek, and in an instant she collapses. Her body strikes the floor with a sound that cuts through the silence. Gasps ripple through the congregation. The mother screams. Priests rush forward. Someone calls her name. The girl does not move. Her hand remains outstretched, fingers curled, as if still holding to something unseen. Her lips twitch, but no sound escapes. For a moment, the cathedral believes she is dead. Then her chest rises, shallow, unsteady, and her eyes flutter open. But something isn't right. Her gaze is vacant, her pupils dilated. Her breath comes in sharp, uneven pulls. And when the priest leans close, when he whispers her name, she whispers back. The prayers are not enough. The words are barely audible. Her lips tremble as she says them again. The prayers are not enough. The crowd recoils. Mothers clutch their children. A man makes the sign of the cross. Others whisper frantically, their voices shaking with confusion, with fear. The girl's mother weeps. She gathers a child into her arms, insists it is delirium, insists she is only faint, but her daughter keeps repeating it. The prayers are not enough. Over and over in the same hollow tone, until her voice fades, and she loses consciousness once more. Doctors are summoned. They carry her from a nave, through the square, into the rectory where she is laid on a bed. They examine her with cold hands, flashlights in her eyes, stethoscopes against her chest. Their diagnosis is simple: shock. Her fainting is attributed to nerves, to heat, to the strain of the crowd. Her words, they say, were nonsense. But her mother does not believe them, because when the girl wakes, hours later, she whispers the same words again. Not nonsense, not delirium, but a message. The prayers are not enough. By evening, the story has spread. It passes from lips to lips in hushed voices. The faithful murmur in the pews. The skeptics shout in the square. Some say the girl was chosen, that she carried a message from the Virgin herself. Others insist it is proof of deception, that the statue is no miracle, but an idol demanding more. The cathedral trembles under the weight of division. The bishop tries to silence it. He calls it a child's imagination. He tells his priests to speak no further of it. But the fear has already taken hold, because the words will not leave their minds. The prayers are not enough. Not enough for what? Not enough for whom? The girl does not return to the cathedral. Her family leaves town within days. But the memory remains. Her fainting body, her whispering lips, her warning, and the pews grow heavier with silence. Those who kneel to pray find their thoughts restless. They wonder if their words matter, if their offerings are seen, if the Madonna's tears are sorrow not for their pain, but for their failure. One pilgrim confesses he could no longer speak aloud in front of her, that every time he opened his mouth, he felt mocked, judged, weighed. Another admits she tore her written prayers into pieces before placing them at the pedestal. It wasn't enough, she said. It never felt like enough. The offerings grow larger, no longer coins, no longer flowers, but gold rings, necklaces, heirlooms generations old, objects once locked in drawers, now scattered at her feet. And still the whispers return. The prayers are not enough. At night, when the cathedral is emptied, the sacristan swears he hears her voice echoing in the rafters. Not a child's voice, not a priest's, but hers, repeating the same words the girl spoke. And that's when he realizes it is not a request, it is a demand. The cathedral staff grow restless. They avoid being alone with her. They keep candles burning longer, fearing the silence that creeps when the flames go out. The bishop, though still commanding in his sermons, cannot sleep. Those close to him notice the change. His face pale, his hands trembling. They say he wakes in the night, whispering the same words. The prayers are not enough. But he does not admit it. He cannot admit it, because if the prayers are not enough, then what is? The white Madonna remains still, her gaze steady, her lips parted, her tears falling as before. But now every tear carries a new weight, because those who see them no longer call them sorrow. They call them hunger. And the faithful are left with only one question. If the prayers are not enough, what will be? The nave stood in silence. Dust floated in the air like suspended breath, drifting in shafts of pale morning light that cut through the stained glass windows. For the first time in weeks, the pews were empty. The murmurs, the offerings, the waiting lines outside cathedral doors, gone. All that remained was the echo of locked hinges, the sound of iron chains tightened around ancient wood. The Vatican had arrived. They came in plain black cars, unmarked, moving deliberately through the cobbled streets at dawn. Priests in heavy coats, faces unreadable, carrying leather cases that seemed too clinical for a church. Behind them, two men in suits, their silence more forceful than words. They entered the cathedral with the calm precision of surgeons, and within minutes, access was forbidden. But something wasn't right. The townspeople watched from a distance, from behind fences, from upper windows. They saw holy water drained into sealed vials, candles blown out by gloved hands, and finally, the statue itself surrounded with scaffolding and tarps. It was as though their sanctuary had been turned into a laboratory. Some said it was necessary. The church had to be sure. Others whispered it was betrayal, that Rome had come not to protect, but to bury the truth. By nightfall, the village felt severed. The doors of the cathedral now bore the red wax seal of the Curia, thick rope tied across the handles, a warning no one dared test. For centuries, the people of the town had prayed inside those walls, and now, for the first time, they prayed outside, on the steps, in the cold, but they kept looking upward, to the tower's looming shadow, to the hidden figure inside, because rumor was already spreading. The tears had changed. What had once shimmered clear as glass now ran darker, reddish, almost like blood. The Vatican's own investigators noticed it too. At least one of them did. A parish janitor claimed he overheard a priest muttering in Latin as he stared at a cloth sample under the light, his voice low, his hand shaking. But the reports, when sent back to Rome, said nothing. Condensation, environmental, explained. That was the word given to the town. And yet, each night, after the cathedral was locked and the guards dismissed, the villagers swore they heard something else, soft, subtle, woven between the silence of the nave, a sound that traveled down the stone corridors, slipping through cracks in the stained glass, the sound of someone sobbing. At midnight, always at midnight, a group of young men, desperate to prove it, carried a tape recorder to the steps. They pressed against a locked door, held still until their arms ached, then ran home to play back what they caught. The first minute was nothing but the hollow hum of empty space. The second, a faint whistle of wind. But in the third, under the distortion of tape hiss, came the unmistakable rhythm of breath. And then, a single drawn-out exhale. Like grief, like mourning. The recording was played in hushed circles, passed between hands in darkened kitchens. Some claimed they could hear words buried inside the weeping. A name, a prayer, a warning. Others swore it was nothing more than faulty tape. But those who stood outside the cathedral at night knew it was real, because when the clock tower struck 12, they could feel it, a vibration beneath the stone steps, a heaviness in the air that pressed against the lungs, as though the statue itself was crying within the sealed walls. The Vatican stayed silent. Weeks passed. Then, without announcement, the black cars returned. Investigators filed out, carrying their cases once more. This time they did not walk in calmly. They hurried. They moved with urgency. And the few townsfolk watching swore. They saw stains on the linen-wrapped bundles carried into the trunks. When the convoy finally left, the chains were replaced. Stronger. The wax seal pressed deeper. The message was clear. Whatever they had found inside was not meant to be seen. But the town had already seen too much. They gathered again at the steps, candles trembling in their hands. Some prayed louder now. Others refused to bow at all. And children, restless in their parents' arms, asked why the Virgin had stopped smiling. Because something in her expression, when glimpsed through the small cracks in the tarp, seemed to have shifted. The stone cheeks hollowed, the eyes sharper, the mouth drawn in sorrow that had not been there before. One man, an old sacristan who had tended the cathedral for 50 years, broke down in front of the crowd. He begged them to leave. He said the walls inside were colder now. He said the sound was growing stronger. No one believed him, but they remembered his words, especially weeks later, when the first guard abandoned his post. The man never spoke to anyone again. He simply packed his belongings, boarded a night train, and vanished. All he left behind was a note. 5 words. I cannot hear it anymore. The paper was creased from his trembling hands, and though no one understood what he meant, everyone knew it was about the cathedral. Everyone knew it was about the weeping, and the question no one could silence was simple. If the Virgin was crying, what was she crying for? And why did Rome want to keep it hidden? The townsfolk never said it aloud, but each of them carried the same thought in the dark, that maybe the statue wasn't warning them. Maybe she was mourning them. Already, before it had even happened, the nave was silent when the last candle was snuffed, a hollow silence. One that carried itself to the rafters and pressed into the corners of the stone. In that stillness, the priest began to write. He was not a young man. His hair carried the dull silver of years bent over altars. His face had been etched with care and fatigue in equal measure. Yet the lines he began to trace in his journal bore none of the calm expected from a shepherd of souls. The first entries were steady. Measured, he wrote of duties carried out, confessions heard, baptisms performed. But between the ink, a tone began to shift. He described the statue again, not just the tears, not only the way pilgrims pressed their hands together before it. He wrote that her eyes seemed to move, not all at once, not like the tricks of mirrors or shadows. He insisted it was subtle, a faint turn, the narrowing of focus, enough to make him pause mid-prayer. But something wasn't right. When he returned home, the silence followed him. He lit no candles that evening, yet he swore the smell of wax lingered in his small quarters. And then came the sound, soft at first, a faint dripping, as though water struck stone somewhere just out of sight. And then, unmistakably, weeping. He pressed the journal flat against the desk and wrote quickly, as though writing faster could keep the sound away. The next day, he told no one, not the sacristan, not the choir boy. Instead, he knelt before the statue again, whispering in his office, his lips dry, and the sound returned, not in the nave, not in the cloister. Inside him, he wrote, "It is as if her sorrow seeps through the walls. I hear her tears on the stairs. I hear them in the sacristy. I hear them even in my dreams." The entries grew shorter after that, his penmanship less precise. Smudges marked the margins where ink had bled under a trembling hand. And that's when he heard it. A voice, not spoken, not external, but impressed into him like the press of a finger into wax. He recorded only one line from it. "She weeps for us all." The parishioners noticed the change. His sermons, once measured in calm, became scattered. He would pause mid-sentence, glance to the corner of the nave, stare toward the statue as though expecting it to finish the homily for him. At night, his neighbor said a light burned in his window until dawn, the pages of his journal filled with phrases that repeated over and over. "Her eyes move. The sound follows me. She weeps for us all." And then, nothing. The handwriting stopped. The last entry dated just 3 days after the Vatican men had left the city. The book remained on his desk, his cassock folded neatly at the foot of his bed, his door unlocked, but the priest himself was gone. No one saw him leave. No one heard a carriage or a knock at the rectory door. The sacristan waited until the bells tolled noon, then evening, then the following dawn. Still no sign. The journal passed quietly between hands. At first, between parish officials. Then, whispered about among townsfolk. And those who read it confessed a strange unease. Because late at night, when the words were read aloud, some claimed the sound of soft crying could be heard from the back of the room. A sound no one wanted to follow. And when the cathedral doors opened again, the statue still stood, her face wet, her eyes cast downward, watching, waiting, and the priest who had written of her sorrow was never seen again. The night was colder than most. The kind of cold that doesn't simply press against the skin, but settles into the lungs, weighing down every breath. Inside the cathedral, the candles burned low. Their light flickered against marble and gold, the shadows bending, reaching, twisting along the walls. The acolytes were finishing their duties. Boys no older than 16, their voices hushed, their movements practiced. They swept the aisles, straightened the hymnals, polished the candlesticks. A routine they had carried out many times before. But something wasn't right. One of them looked up. His eyes lingered on the statue of the Virgin at the front of the nave. The figure stood exactly as it always had, stone robes cascading downward, hands folded in prayer, eyes cast at the floor. Only now it seemed different. The air moved, not a draft, not the shift of an open door, but a ripple like cloth stirring the wind. And her robes, stone immovable, appeared to sway. At first, none of them spoke. They turned back to their tasks, convincing themselves it was imagination, a trick of fatigue. But the youngest lingered. He swore the fold of the statue's garment had fluttered, as though something alive pressed against the stone from within. He opened his mouth to call to the others. When the doors shut, a hollow crack echoed through Cathedral. The great oak doors slammed into place, bolts sliding into their iron sockets without a hand touching them. The acolytes ran, their palms pressed against the wood, pulling, pushing, tugging at the locks. Nothing moved, and then the silence fell. Not the natural hush of an empty church, not the reverent quiet of prayer. This was a silence that pressed on them, that filled the ears like weight, that made even breathing sound like blasphemy. One by one, they turned back toward the statue. Her head had not moved. Her eyes were still cast downward, but her presence seemed different now. The air thickened around her. Every flicker of candlelight seemed to bend in her direction, and that's when he heard it, the soft rustle of fabric. Not stone, not wood, fabric. The boys froze where they stood. Their chests heaved, hands clenched around rosaries, and slowly, as if compelled, they sank to their knees. No words passed between them. No instructions were given. They knelt together, facing the statue, their heads bowed. The hours passed. Outside, the night wore on. The city quieted, the streets emptied, but within those locked doors, the acolytes did not move. The candles burned down to pools of wax. The shadows stretched long, then short again with the moonlight through the stained glass. Still they knelt. Their lips did not part. Their eyes did not lift. They remained in silence, rigid, as though the act of rising would mean something worse than death. And when morning came, the doors opened on their own. The sacristan entered first. His footsteps echoed down the nave. He called their names, but none answered. There they were, 6 boys still kneeling, their bodies upright, stiff as stone, their faces pale, their eyes open but unfocused. And when he tried to lift them, to shake them awake, he realized they were awake. They were breathing. They were alive, but not a single one could speak. The physicians came. The bishop himself ordered them examined, but the diagnosis was always the same. The boys were not mute by illness. Their throats bore no injury. Their voices had not been stolen. They had simply stopped speaking. Not one word escaped their lips again. Not to their families. Not to their priests. Not even in their sleep. They lived. They walked. They ate. But silence followed them everywhere. Some said their silence was a vow. Others whispered it was obedience to something only they had seen. The townsfolk gave the night a name. They called it the Night of the Shrouds. And those who passed by the cathedral in the dark claimed that sometimes, when the candles flickered against the statue's robes, they still moved, ever so slightly, as though stirred by a wind that no one else could feel. The square outside the cathedral was empty. The lamps burned with a thin yellow light, their glow scattering the fog that clung low to the ground. A stillness pressed in over the town, not the peaceful stillness of sleep, but something heavier, something that seemed to wait. At first, no one noticed the trucks. They rolled in past midnight, engines muted, their headlights blackened, covered canvas stretched across their frames, wheels crunching against cobblestone as they approached the cathedral gates. The men who stepped out did not speak. They moved with rehearsed precision, boots striking in rhythm, their collars marked not with parish insignia, but with the plain black of Vatican order. Somewhere in the shadows, villagers watched, curtains lifted just an inch, breath caught in their throats. They knew this was not a ceremony for the faithful. This was something else. The cathedral doors groaned open. Metal hinges, long accustomed to silence, were forced awake. And for the first time in decades, the statue was to be moved. But something wasn't right. The orders came sealed, stamped with the insignia of Rome. The reason, officially, was structural instability. Yet no cracks marred the stone. No fracture spread across its foundation. The walls of the cathedral stood firm. Still, the men advanced. Armed guards lined the perimeter, rifles clutched tight, eyes scanning the rooftops. Not soldiers, not locals, but Vatican trained. Inside, scaffolds were raised, chains lowered from pulleys. The echo of metal rang sharp against the vaulted ceiling. One villager, an old woman, swore she heard a sound then, a low hum rising from within the nave, like a voice muffled under stone. She crossed herself and backed away from her window. The statue loomed over them, its robes carved in folds that fell like frozen water, its face calm, its eyes lowered. The men worked quickly, ropes tightened around the base, hands pressed into cold marble as they sought leverage. And then, the first drop, red, dark, thick, it slipped from the corner of the statue's eye, trailing down her cheek. One worker froze. He reached out with trembling fingers, touched the stone. His hand came away stained. And that's when he heard it, a gasp, not from the statue, but from his own men. They had seen it too, blood running from a virgin's eyes, slow at first, then faster, streaking down her robes, catching the folds of stone, dripping to floor below. The men stepped back. Some made the sign of the cross. Others cursed under their breath, but the order remained. The Vatican had commanded its removal, so they lifted it. Chains strained, pulleys creaked. The weight of the stone figure groaned as it was torn from its pedestal. And as it rose, suspended in the air, the blood did not stop. It streaked across the stone arms, staining the floor where the statue had once stood. Villagers whispered from their windows. Some swore they saw her head tilt, ever so slightly, as if acknowledging the night. The guards shouted for silence. The men continued their work, their eyes downcast, their faces pale. By the time the statue was lowered onto the truck bed, the floor beneath it was slick with red. But in the morning, the official record would tell a different story. Removal due to structural instability. No mention of the blood. No mention of the silence that followed. No mention of the acolytes who never spoke again. The documents were signed, sealed, filed away in Rome. But those who stood in the square that night remembered. They remembered the way the doors locked themselves. They remembered the whispers that passed through the crowd. They remembered the blood that stained the stone. And though the statue was gone, the space it had once occupied seemed heavier. The pedestal sat bare, but the air around it carried weight. Priests said Mass as if nothing had happened. Hymns echoed, incense rose, candles burned. But parishioners shifted in their pews. Eyes glanced toward the empty space. Whispers spread through the town. What had been removed had not been forgotten. And some claimed that weeks later, when the cathedral was quiet, they could still hear the slow drip of liquid striking stone. Even though the statue was gone, even though the space was empty, even though Rome had sealed the truth away, the sound remained, and no document could erase it. The cathedral stood unchanged, at least from the outside. Stone walls still rose against the sky, weathered but proud. Bells still tolled on the hour, their sound rolling across the valley. But once you stepped inside, it was different. The space felt thinner, colder. Shadows seemed to gather where they had no business gathering. Corners stretched darker than before, as if the light hesitated to reach them. And at the center of it all, the pedestal, bare, abandoned, a scar where the statue had once stood. The priests tried to continue as if nothing had changed. Candles were lit, hymns sung, incense drifted upward, curling into the vaulted ceiling. But something wasn't right. Parishioners noticed it first. The way the air around the altar felt damp. Not just the air, the stone itself. For weeks after the statue's removal, the floor glistened. A film of moisture clung to the marble, though no leak was ever found. No water lines above. No broken pipes. Some touched the stone. They said it felt warm, as if something alive still lingered there. Others avoided it altogether. They shifted in the pews, choosing seats further back. Eyes strayed forward, but few dared to approach. And still the dampness spread, pooling faintly in the cracks, darkening the seams between the tiles. At night, the cathedral should have been silent, but the watchman spoke of sounds, a faint dripping, like water falling from a great height. Only there was no water. Then came the pilgrims. They had always come. Travelers, devotees, the curious. Word of the statue had drawn them for years, but now they came for something else. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps fear, perhaps the hope of seeing what Rome had taken away. Some prayed at the empty pedestal. Others whispered questions into silence. Some left gifts, rosaries, flowers, coins, as if the absence itself had become holy. And then they began to vanish. Not all at once, not in great numbers, but one by one. A woman who entered before dawn and never returned home. A young man who told friends he would stay just a moment in the cathedral. A pair of sisters last seen lighting candles near the altar. Their belongings remained. Shoes neatly placed by the pews. Bags tucked against the wall. But the people themselves, gone. And those who did return were changed. They spoke softly, as if afraid their words might carry. Eyes hollow, faces pale. When pressed, they all said the same thing. They had heard it, the weeping. It came from behind the altar. A sound so faint it might have been imagined. A woman sobbed, steady, unrelenting. One pilgrim described standing frozen as the sound wrapped around him. Not loud, not sudden, just constant, like grief without end. He swore it lasted minutes. Others said hours. And though they searched, behind the altar there was nothing. Stone walls, bare floors, empty space. Yet the weeping remained. Priests dismissed the claims. They urged calm. They told the parishioners that silence was being misheard, that grief played tricks on the senses. But in private, even they avoided the altar after dusk. One young cleric confessed to hearing it himself. He said he had followed the sound to the sacristy door, only to find it locked tight. No one inside. No one at all. And that's when he heard it. A whisper, so close it seemed to breathe against his ear. He fled, and never returned. The dampness on the floor did not fade. It thickened, spread. Some mornings, droplets could be seen gathering, as if the stone itself were sweating. Pilgrims still came, but fewer each week. The stories of vanishing spread. Families began to refuse entry. Fathers forbade daughters. Mothers warned sons. Yet still, some were drawn in, compelled, as if the empty space itself demanded witness. The cathedral became a place of unease. Masses were quieter. Fewer voices joined the hymns. Eyes drifted toward the altar, searching for movement, listening for sound, because though nothing stood there, it did not feel empty. The absence had become presence. And with each passing day, the silence deepened, until finally, one night, a pilgrim returned with his hair turned white. He could barely speak. His hands shook. He muttered only a single phrase, again and again. She's still there. She never left. No one asked him to explain, because deep down, they already knew the cathedral had lost its statue, but it had not lost its weight. The weeping lingered. The dampness spread. The altar remained empty, and yet not empty at all. The space had become something else entirely, something that could not be removed, something that refused to let go. The corridors beneath the Vatican are not meant to be seen. Stone halls stretch endlessly, their walls pressed close with centuries of parchment and relics sealed in dust. The air there is still, heavy, almost without time. But deeper still, beyond where archivists walk, beyond where guard will linger, lies a door few have ever opened. And it is here, some whisper, the statue was taken. They say it was brought under cover of night, crated, sealed, and carried to the labyrinth of passageways until it vanished into the archives. No record remains, no ledger signed, only the silence of men who will not speak. Yet fragments of testimony survive. A guard who once worked the archives told of one chamber no assignment lasted more than a single watch. He said the air there was colder. He said shadows bent strangely against the lantern light. And in the hours before dawn, he thought he heard it. A woman sobbed, faint, muffled, as if from behind the stone itself. But something wasn't right. Others confirmed the same. Men transferred. Some refused duty entirely. One priest who cataloged relics in the lower stacks admitted he never set foot near that room. He claimed the doors were always damp to the touch, as if the walls themselves perspired. And no one questioned what lay within, for in the Vatican, silence can be an answer, Some believed the statue was hidden to protect it, that its tears were a miracle, an outpouring of grief for a suffering world, something to be guarded, preserved. But others are not so certain. They recall the disappearances, the pilgrims who never returned, the way the cathedral itself seemed to darken when the figure was removed. They wonder, was it grief or warning? Because what the church locked away is not always what it treasures. Sometimes it is what it fears. And so the statue sits, if it sits at all, sealed in a chamber without a name, unvisited, unblessed, watched only by silence. But silence is not absence. For those who claim to have passed near that place, one detail remains. A sound, too soft to name at first. A trickle, a hush, and then a sob. And that's when he heard it. The guard said he pressed his ear to the cold stone. The sound was there, unmistakable. A woman weeping. He swore he felt the stone tremble beneath his palm. Moisture slicked his skin, and though he stood alone, he knew he was not unseen. He quit within a week. He never returned. Today, the archives stand locked as they always have. Visitors are guided only to certain wings. The rest remain sealed. Hidden in corridors no maps described. And so the questions remain unanswered. Was a miracle a sign of faith made flesh? Or was it something else? A warning given form. A grief too deep to bear witness to. What does it mean when stone weeps? When silence is filled with sobs no one dares to acknowledge. The Vatican will not say. The priest will not answer. The doors remain closed. And yet, the story spread. Passed from pilgrim to pilgrim. Whispered by archivists. Echoed by guards who never wished to serve there again. They all agree on one thing. If she wept once, she could weep again. And the world may not be ready for what that means. Because miracles are not always blessings. And grief is not always a prayer. Sometimes it is a warning. And if she still weeps beneath the stone halls of the Vatican, then somewhere above us all, something is listening, waiting, and the sound of her sorrow may yet rise again. When it does, will anyone dare to listen? Perhaps statues weep because our prayers are not enough. Perhaps they weep because they see what comes next.